The delivery truck backed into my driveway on a Tuesday afternoon. Two men in heavy canvas work jackets climbed out and began unstrapping a massive wooden shipping crate from the flatbed. I had not ordered anything large, and my wife Sunny was at work, so I walked out to the driveway to see what was going on. The driver handed me a clipboard and told me to sign for a freight delivery paid in full by someone named Milford. That is my father. It is also my name, and it was his father's name. I am Milford III, though I have spent my entire adult life aggressively avoiding the use of that name, preferring my middle name in professional settings and asking friends to call me Ford. I signed for the delivery. The two men wheeled the heavy crate into my garage, tipped it onto the concrete floor, and drove away. I spent the next 20 minutes using a steel pry bar to rip the wooden slats off the top. Inside, wrapped in thick layers of moving blankets and industrial plastic, was a baby crib. It was not just any crib. It was hand-carved from solid dark mahogany, heavy and ornate, looking more like a piece of medieval castle furniture than something you would put a modern infant to sleep in. I pulled away the final layer of plastic wrapping from the headboard. Carved deeply into the center of the wood, in large Gothic lettering, were the words Milford IV. There was an invoice taped to the side of the box. The total cost was $3,200. It had been ordered 6 months ago, right around the time Sunny and I first announced we were pregnant. I stood in the cold garage, staring at the carved letters, feeling a familiar, heavy exhaustion settling in my chest. To understand why a piece of nursery furniture made me want to drive my car into a river, you have to understand my family's business. My grandfather, the original Milford, started a small lumber yard in upstate New York in the late 1960s. He worked 7 days a week, built a reputation for honesty, and made a decent living. When my father took over in the 80s, he transformed that single lumber yard into a regional hardware and building supply empire. We now have 5 massive locations, a fleet of delivery trucks, and a stranglehold on commercial contractor supplies in our county. My father is a man who believes in legacy above all other human concepts. He views the business not as a way to make money, but as a kingdom he is building for his bloodline. Growing up, I was never allowed to just be a kid playing in the backyard. I was the heir apparent. From the time I was 8 years old, I was sweeping sawdust off the concrete floors of the main warehouse. By 12, I was doing inventory counts on boxes of galvanized screws. Whenever my father introduced me to his contractors or vendors, he would put a heavy hand on my shoulder, squeeze tightly, and announce that I was Milford III, the future boss, the boy who would one day be signing their checks. I hated it. I hated the smell of the warehouse. I hated the retail hours, and most importantly, I hated that the trajectory of my entire life was decided for me before I took my first breath. I did not want to sell building materials. I wanted to build the buildings. I wanted to be a structural engineer. The breaking point happened the summer after I graduated high school. I had secretly applied to a prestigious engineering program at a state university 3 hours away and secured a partial scholarship. When the acceptance letter arrived, my father intercepted the mail. I walked into his office at the main warehouse to find him sitting behind his metal desk, his face red with quiet fury. He told me that going away to study engineering was an act of betrayal. He had already set up a desk for me in the back office. He expected me to take business classes locally at night while working 60 hours a week for him. We had a screaming mess that rattled the glass windows of his office. I told him I did not care about the lumber yards and I did not want his name. I packed my bags that night and moved out. I went to college. I got my degree. I now work for a commercial architecture firm, designing structural frameworks for office buildings. I love my job. When I left, my younger brother Eamon stepped into the void I created. Eamon is 3 years younger than me. He is brilliant, organized, and possesses a work ethic that puts both me and my father to shame. Eamon never wanted to leave. He loved the family business. He went to school locally, got a degree in supply chain management, and came right back to work at the main branch. Over the last 10 years, Eamon and his wife Aya have modernized the entire operation. They transitioned the company from paper ledgers to a cloud-based inventory system, saving the family hundreds of thousands of dollars in lost stock. But Eamon is not named Milford. To my father, this is an insurmountable flaw. No matter how much money Eamon makes the company, no matter how many hours he works, my father still treats him like a middle manager keeping the seat warm. My father views Eamon as the spare, the backup plan that had to be activated because the true heir defected. For years, my relationship with my father was a cold war. My mother, Lynette, is a relentless peacemaker. She is the only reason we still attend family holidays. She smooths over the sharp edges, changes the subject when things get tense, and begs me privately to just nod and smile when my father talks about his legacy. Sunny and I maintained a polite, distant relationship with my parents. We bought a house an hour away. We saw them once a month for a Sunday dinner. Then Sunny got pregnant. The moment we announced the pregnancy, the dynamic shifted. When we found out at 20 weeks that we were having a boy, my father completely lost his mind. All of his past resentment toward me evaporated instantly. In his eyes, my rebellion was suddenly forgiven because I had fulfilled my primary biological duty. I was producing Milford IV. The campaign started subtly. First, it was monogrammed silver baby rattles with the letter M engraved on the handles. Then it was small embroidered blankets. My mother called me constantly, dropping heavy hints about how happy my father was, how this baby was breathing new life into him, how he was finally talking about retiring in a few years and handing the reins over. Sonny and I had already chosen a name. We decided on Renato. It was the name of Sonny's grandfather, a man who immigrated to this country with nothing and worked as a tailor until his fingers bled to send his daughters to college. It is a name that means something to both of us. It represents quiet sacrifice and genuine love, not corporate branding. We told my mother about the name Renato in confidence when Sonny was 6 months pregnant. My mother turned pale. She begged us not to tell my father yet. She said the shock would break his heart and we should just wait until the baby was born, hoping that holding his grandson would soften the blow. We agreed to keep it quiet, mostly to avoid the stress on Sonny during her 3rd trimester. But then the crib arrived in my garage, $3,000 of arrogant, presumptive mahogany. Sonny came home from work an hour later. She parked in the driveway and walked into the garage. She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw the massive carved headboard leaning against the wall. She dropped her purse on the concrete. She did not yell. She just started crying, the kind of deep, exhausted tears that come from months of suppressed anxiety. She told me she felt completely erased. She felt like she was just a vessel carrying a corporate asset from my father's vanity project. I held her in the garage and promised her that the crib was never crossing the threshold of our house. 2 days later, my father escalated the situation past the point of no return. He drove out to our house on a Thursday evening unannounced. Sonny was upstairs resting. My father walked into my kitchen, accepted a glass of water, and dropped a heavy navy blue leather folder onto my granite kitchen island. He looked incredibly proud of himself. He tapped the folder with his thick fingers and told me it was time to talk about the future. I opened the folder. Inside were legally binding trust fund documents drawn up by his estate lawyer. The paperwork established an irrevocable trust with an initial deposit of $250,000. I looked up at him, genuinely shocked. That is life-changing money. It would guarantee my son's college tuition, his first house down payment, his entire financial foundation. Then I read the stipulations on the second page. The beneficiary of the trust was explicitly, legally defined as Milford IV. There was a clause stating that if the child did not hold that exact legal first and middle name upon the recording of the birth certificate, the trust would automatically dissolve and the funds would revert back to my father's general estate. Furthermore, the trust dictated that the principal balance could only be accessed after the child turned 25, provided that he had completed at least 4 consecutive years of full-time employment at the family company. I stopped reading and looked at my father. I asked him if this was a gift for his grandson or an employment contract for a future employee. He bristled. He stood up straighter, crossing his arms over his chest. He told me that wealth comes with responsibility. He said he was securing the bloodline and ensuring that the business he poured his blood and sweat into would be shepherded by a man who respected the family name. He told me I was foolish to walk away from my birthright, but he was not going to let his grandson make the same mistake. I slid the folder across the granite island back toward him. I told him we were not signing anything. I told him he could take the trust fund and keep it. He laughed, a short, dismissive sound. He told me I was being overly emotional and that I would change my mind when the hospital bill started arriving. He left the folder on the counter and walked out the front door, fully confident that the money would buy my submission. I threw the folder in the trash the moment his car left the driveway. The inevitable explosion happened this past Sunday. My mother had invited the whole family over for a large roast chicken dinner. Sonny and I drove up. I knew this was going to be the day I ended the speculation. I was not going to let Sonny give birth under the shadow of this unspoken war. We sat around the large dining room table. The smell of rosemary and roasting fat filled the room. Eamon and Aya were sitting across from us. Eamon looked incredibly nervous. He kept adjusting his collar and glancing at his wife. Aya reached over and squeezed his hand beneath the table. Before my mother could serve the food, Eamon stood up. He cleared his throat and asked for everyone's attention. He announced that Aya was 12 weeks pregnant. They had just received the results of their genetic testing, and everything was perfectly healthy. Furthermore, the testing confirmed they were having a boy. Sonny and I erupted in cheers. We jumped up, hugged Eamon, and hugged Aya. My mother burst into happy tears, rushing around the table to embrace her daughter-in-law. I looked down at the end of the table. My father was still sitting in his chair. He was smiling, but it was a tight, polite smile. He picked up his water glass, took a slow sip, and set it down. He nodded at Eamon. He said that was nice news. He said it would be wonderful for little Milford to have a younger cousin to play with in the backyard. The entire room went completely still. My father had just taken the most important moment of my brother's life and reduced it to a supporting role for my unborn child. He had dismissed Eamon's son as nothing more than a playmate for the true heir. Eamon's shoulders slumped. The light completely left his eyes. He sat back down heavily in his chair, staring at his empty dinner plate. Aya looked furious. I felt a sudden blinding heat rise in my chest. Decades of resentment boiled over in a fraction of a second. I looked directly at my father from across the length of the table. I kept my voice dead level. I told him there was no little Milford coming. My father stopped cutting his chicken. He looked up at me, his eyes narrowing. He asked me what I was talking about. I told him the baby's name was Renato. I told him it was final. The paperwork for the hospital was already filled out and the name was not up for negotiation. I told him the heavy oak crib he sent to my house was sitting by the curb waiting for the municipal garbage truck on Tuesday morning. I told him his legal folder full of bribes was sitting in my kitchen trash can covered in coffee grounds. My father turned a terrifying shade of purple. He threw his heavy linen napkin onto his plate. He stood up, slamming both palms down on the dining table so hard the silverware rattled against the china. He started screaming. He yelled that I was spitting on my grandfather's grave. He said I was stealing his legacy out of spite. He yelled that the family line ends with me, that I am a selfish, ungrateful child who takes everything the family built for granted. He pointed a thick finger at me and told me that if I put the name Renato on that birth certificate, I would be written out of his will completely. He said I would not see a single dime of the company profits, the properties, or the liquid assets. I did not blink. I told him to do it. I told him to call his lawyer on Monday morning and cut me out entirely. I told him I did not want his money because the money is poison. Then I pointed at Eamon. I told my father to look at his other son, the son who stayed. The son who actually saved his archaic company from bankruptcy by modernizing it while my father sat in his office playing king. I told him Eamon deserves every single penny of that inheritance. I told him Eamon is 10 times the man I am, and if my father had any sense, he would hand the keys to the empire over to him today. I said it was pathetic that he cared more about a combination of letters on a birth certificate than he cared about the actual living son sitting right in front of him. My father stared at me, his chest heaving. He looked at Eamon, then back to me. He said Eamon is a fine manager, but he is not a Milford. Eamon stood up. He did not say a word to my father. He reached down, helped Aya out of her chair, grabbed her coat, and walked straight out the front door. I heard his car start in the driveway and speed away. Sonny and I left less than a minute later, leaving my mother standing in the dining room sobbing into her hands. It has been 4 days since the dinner. The fallout has been catastrophic. My mother is calling me twice a day, leaving long, tearful voicemails. She says my father is absolutely heartbroken. She says he is an old man facing his own mortality, and all he wanted was to see his family name live on before he dies. She is begging me to compromise. She wants me to make Milford the middle name, just to keep the peace and bridge the gap. She says I am tearing the family apart over pride. Eamon called me yesterday. It was a very difficult conversation. He thanked me for finally defending him to our father. He said he appreciated what I said about his work for the company, but his voice was tight with anger. He told me that by blowing up the family dynamic in such a spectacular, public way, I just made his life a living hell. Eamon still works for the company. He still has to share an office building with our father every single day. He told me our father has been a nightmare this week, screaming at vendors, throwing clipboards in the warehouse, and taking all of his rage and humiliation out on the staff. Eamon said I got to drop a grenade and drive back to my quiet house an hour away, leaving him to clean up the shrapnel while his wife is newly pregnant. Sunny is incredibly stressed. She is 34 weeks pregnant and barely sleeping. She supports my decision completely, but the stress of the shattered family is taking a physical toll on her. She is constantly checking her phone, dreading the next text message from my mother or a furious email from my father. I am standing my ground. I refuse to let my son be branded like cattle. I refuse to let him grow up under the shadow of an expectation he never asked for. I want him to be his own person, free to choose his own path, without a heavy mahogany crib dictating his future before he can even speak. But as I sit in my house, looking at the silent, empty space in the nursery where a crib should be, the guilt is starting to eat away at me. I wonder if I handled this the wrong way. I wonder if my mother is right, and it is just a name, a small concession I could have made to bring joy to an old man who built everything we have. I wonder if I was selfish to use Eamon as a weapon in my argument, leaving him trapped in the crossfire of a war I started and then walked away from. Am I the a-hole for refusing to carry on this tradition, rejecting the trust fund, and fracturing my entire family right before my son is born?